You won't believe the shocking, horrifying role of women during the Vietnam War. The now famous American sniper Carlos Hathcock was on the hunt for another sniper known as the Apache in 1966. His Viet-Kong adversary gave him the alias Long TT Rang, which translates to white feather, because he wore a visible white feather in his boomy cap. This earned him the nickname, because the Vietnamese sharpshooter would execute awful tortures on the bodies of caught Americans as they were being interrogated. The U.S. soldiers died as a result. During interrogation, the Apache would cut captive United States Marines and soldiers before allowing them to bleed to death. It was rumored that GIS had portions of their flesh taken off of them, their eyelids cut off, and their fingernails plucked. This is just a little compared to the shocking, horrifying roles of women during the Vietnam War. After seeing the mutilated remains of one of these unfortunate soldiers, Sergeant Hathcock and his observer, Captain John Burke, made a solemn promise to put an end to the Apache's reign of terror. In 1966, Hathcock put an end to the Apache conflict near Hill 55, which was close to the demilitarized zone that divided North Vietnam and South Vietnam at the time. He only needed one shot to end the life of the woman. It is true that the Apache was a woman, and there were thousands upon thousands of other women who fought alongside the Vietcong. Until the United States military participation in Vietnam came to an end, this communist guerrilla group continued to cause problems for Americans stationed in Vietnam. This article will provide a quick introduction to the history of the Vietnamese and American women who served throughout the Vietnam War. This history is relatively unknown, yet it is intriguing. The United States first became involved in Vietnam in 1954, 2 years after the French, the country's previous colonial masters, were expelled as a direct result of the legendary Battle of Dien Bien Phu. The loss and the subsequent peace talks that followed it culminated in the split of Vietnam into two countries, the Communist Democratic Republic of Vietnam, also known as North Vietnam, and the Republic of Vietnam, also known as South Vietnam. The North Vietnamese made a commitment to uphold the peace treaties that ended their war with the French, but nearly as soon as they did that, they started making plans for the conquest of the South. However, the true beginning of their attempt to destabilize the South in order to finally gain control of it did not start until the early 1960s. By 1961, the government of the United States was concerned that if additional aid from the United States in the form of money, equipment, and initially just a select few military advisors was not provided, the government of South Vietnam would fall and the communists would seize control. The American military engagement in South Vietnam increased in 1965 when it became evident that only providing South Vietnam with money, equipment, and a handful of advisors would not be enough to preserve the country. Over 500,000 American troops were present in the country at its peak time of involvement. They would be battling women on the front lines, behind the lines, and in the media. Some of the people they would be fighting were women, a portion of the Ho Chi Minh Trail. During the war, the North Vietnamese used a network of roads, tunnels, and trails that became known as the Ho Chi Minh Trail to transport troops, equipment, and supplies to the south. In honor of the individual who was responsible for guiding North Vietnam to its independence and who served as president of the country during the early stages of the conflict between the United States and Vietnam. The name of the trail makes it sound as if it was just one long dirt track spanning from North to South Vietnam, but in reality, it was multiple paths, and a significant portion of the trail traveled along both sides of the border between South Vietnam and Cambodia. The North Vietnamese were well aware that the burgeoning anti-war movement in the United States would be bolstered by any increase of the United States' involvement in the conflict, and in particular by the deployment of United States troops in yet another country. They were aware of two things as a result of this. It is quite unlikely that the United States of America will send ground soldiers into Cambodia. If they did, however, there would be a significant backlash against this decision in the United States. When it was discovered in 1972 that President Nixon had covertly ordered U.S. soldiers into Cambodia, the response was swift and unfavorable, and it culminated in a manner that was extremely embarrassing for the Nixon administration. On the other hand, both President Johnson and his successor, Richard Nixon, were aware that the war would continue indefinitely if nothing was done to at least impede the movement of supplies and weapons along the supply route. On the trail, there were thousands of Vietnamese women working. At least half, if not more, of the people who cut the many tracks, built the tunnels and primitive bridges, and more women who carried the majority of the equipment and drove the trucks through hundreds of miles of jungle and mountainous terrain, were women. These women were mostly young women between the ages of 17 and 35, who were dedicated to both the communist cause and seeing their country united. Women made up a significant portion, if not the majority, of those who lost their lives on the Ho Chi Minh Path. Due to the fact that the region that the route passed through was one of the most heavily bombed places during the war, more bombs were dropped along the areas that the trail passed through. The talents of women were grossly underestimated by the Americans, whereas the Vietnamese acknowledged and made use of the women's ability. Agents of the Viet-Kong who were female operated in close proximity to American bases and gathered vital intelligence. Women have traditionally been in positions of authority in Vietnamese society. Figures such as the Trung sisters, who played a prominent role in the resistance movement against the Chinese, exemplify the women's influence. A notorious Viet-Kong women's outfit known as the Perfume River Squad was responsible for conducting clandestine operations and distributing information and rumors. Women who were taken captive were subjected to cruel treatment and torture, including being held in the infamous tiger cages. A well-known Viet-Kong woman named Vo Thi Tang rose to the status of national hero and served in important government roles after the war. Trinity Ngo, also known as Hanoi Hana, was responsible for broadcasting North Vietnamese propaganda during the Vietnam War. She targeted American soldiers and played on their anxieties and aspirations in a manner that was comparable to Tokyo Rose's actions during World War II. The narrative of Hanoi Hana, a broadcaster from North Vietnam who urged American soldiers to reconsider the war and their presence in Vietnam. Hanoi Hana was known as Hana. Another factor that is discussed is the existence of ladies of the night, or women who were coerced into prostitution in order to serve the needs of American soldiers. This led to a variety of societal problems and unknowingly helped agents working for the Vietcong. Be sure to subscribe for more interesting stories and hit that notification bell now to be the first to know when the next story is up. There were also renowned images that influenced American opinions of the war, such as the image of a South Vietnamese ally murdering a suspected Vietcong guerrilla, and the classic shot of the Napalm Girl, which generated international outrage. Both of these photographs played a role in altering American impressions of the war. In addition to this, it acknowledges the important contribution made by female American nurses who served in Vietnam, mainly in the capacity of surgical nurses. It is important to recognize the contributions made by the nurses who served during the Vietnam War. They were instrumental in preventing the loss of many service members' lives. In spite of their extensive education and years of experience, nurses frequently had to contend with rampant sexism and disrespectful behavior from higher-ranking officers, as well as injured service members. However, the vast majority of troops were grateful for the care and support that was given by the nurses, who often served as surrogate mothers and confidants. It is a fact that many people forget that nurses also experienced PTSD because of the constant exposure they had to injured and mutilated bodies. In addition, this section discusses the efforts made by female reporters, such as Dickie Gillette, who worked under dangerous conditions to report on the conflict. These women served as a source of motivation for a subsequent generation of female war correspondents. Click on this video popping up to know more of historical disturbing facts that will keep you questioning.